other metropolis of the world. An army of beings coming out from the outskirts wander by the streets, and they scavenge in the rubbish, trying to find the waste that can be sold. Unfortunately, the citizens have got used to this image, because as we know, even in the Old Testament was written that we have eyes not to see. In the morning, just a short time before the light opens a new day, another valiant army will delete all traces left by the night visitors, creating a never-ending circuit that could remind us a cycle of nature, but with the difference that this one has been produced by men in contradiction to all natural laws. The world, its movement and its dynamic, has turned into a huge machine that generates waste. All kinds of residues are piled up and transported from one place to another. Its number is esteemed in inconceivable figures. We no longer know what to do with them, how to make them disappear, or at least how to hide them. In spite of all the attempts that have been made to deny the evidence, the truth is that the waste cannot be eliminated. But it's more difficult to conceal the fact that the leftovers are also made of millions of human beings, those ones that have been rejected from the production process of the huge global factory. The growing up traffic of waste has created a fabulous business that generates unimaginable incomes. Every day, thousands of ships loaded with containers move the electronic and computer trash from the first world towards countries that have turned into real dumps. Whole cities in Asia and Africa have changed their natural landscape into high mountains of industrial poisoned crap. Even the own Chinese government has recognized that the 75% of the informatica world trash is dumped over their territory. For example, in Diju City, more than 150,000 people work to recycle the tons of residues that arrive every day. Yet there is another kind of waste, even more troubling, much more difficult to reduce or to make disappear. The human waste. Considering that big prophetic test that was called the Holocaust, we don't know what will be the state of mind in the future, but at least by now, this matter cannot be dealt as a simple technical problem. For several reasons, which of course are not guaranteed forever, the transport, relocation, and hosting of human waste cannot be done by using the same procedure that is applied to the industrial trash, even if both kinds of remainders obey to the same logic. The synchronized functioning of the scientific discourse and capital discourse that include in their dynamic the necessary and unavoidable mechanism of evacuation. Once his merchandise value is completely run out, the subject transformed into stool is dropped into the drain of modernity and becomes a disposable remainder. We cannot blame only the social paradigm for this situation. The degradation of human beings do not obey only to the exercise of a primary barbarism, because we have already had the proof that the hugest catastrophe in history wasn't an accident of modernity process, but it was planned under its name. We must understand the mechanism of the treatise rejection, in which people and things are equally included. And this is not a mere undesirable consequence of a collateral damage of the movement of progress or a side effect, but its last and final goal. The planned obsolescence of things and people, especially of people reduced to the category of things, is the result of a calculation and not of a disgraceful dysfunctioning of the system. This calculation takes advantage of the fact that human beings can be treated like objects serving to the satisfaction of the most inconceivable desires. This happens because human reason, what we call the logos, is dwelled by a strange force that exceeds the limits of thought. We call that force with the word jouissance, to underline something that belongs to the logos and at the same time overflows it. So we can state that man enjoys where he thinks to think, and that his thought, whatever it might be, is molded by that jouissance of which he knows nothing. The fact that he doesn't know, of course, will not prevent the jouissance from realizing either in those fantasies with which he faces reality, or the actions he exerts on his fellows, or in those that his neighbors exert on him. Inequalities and social injustice have since ever been part of human reality. Nevertheless, we should date back to the past in order to understand the specific of our time, of our present time. The history of our civilization is briefly the history of an extraordinary process of sublimation that produced what in psychoanalysis we know as the name of the Father. The name of the Father is a concept that entails the structure of the subject and allows us to understand the mechanism by means of which a being lacking all ontological predetermination, and that is condemned to dwell a language that will denaturalize him, and pushes him into a helpless existence, can, even though in most of cases, find a key signifier, a master signifier able to give him a certain stability and allowing him to build a fiction more or less efficient to bear and manipulate the real. But the name of the Father is also a function that during many centuries ruled the order of the world. An order that, while it existed, was able to contain everything within it. A superior order that we call symbolic, where things found their place and their legitimacy. The ostracism, the forced exile, that was the previous punishment to death that in old Greek times was reserved for the members of high classes, was the only known rejection procedure. In spite of their life conditions, slaves were not excluded from the social bond. As an object belonging to the master, the slave was part of his world. For example, in Rome, in the ancient Rome, slave was considered a member of the family. He had a very well-defined place in the stratification of the polis, and his existence was supported by the law. Even this way may sound strange today for us. The disposition of the life of a slave was not simply left to the master's discretion, who, on the contrary, was obliged to assume certain responsibilities and duties towards his slaves. Masters and slaves, men and gods, even separated by their differences, lived together within the interior of that closed order, that order of signification that was ensured by the name of the Father. When last year, the 26th of April, Ejected and Miller introduced the topic of the next Congress of the World Association of Psychoanalysis, he pointed out that this order world of the name of the Father went together with a certain notion of the real, a real that was immutable, a real that was defined as, I don't know if this translation will be more or less comprehensible for you, what always comes back to the same place. It's more or less okay? And the paradigm of which is nature and the regularity of its eternal laws. It's not easy to track the historic beginning of this progressive and unavoidable dismantling of the symbolic order established by the privilege of the name of the Father. But there is no doubt that modern science contributed dramatically in this sense. Modern science, coming out from the meditation of Descartes and physics of Galileo, is what will definitely stop the notion of nature. A notion that was based in the idea of a finite and visible world. Nature as a representation of a foreseen real, a real articulated to sense and harmony, will be little by little decomposed, and its destruction won't only be the consequence of an economical exploitation, but especially the effect of a discourse that has promoted a certain development of truth that makes superfluous the concept of nature itself. In other words, the degradation, the ecological degradation, cannot be understood just under the light of the raging human greed, but have been preceded by a metamorphosis of the concept of life itself, a metamorphosis that we must attribute to the scientific rationality. Like God, the name of the Father has left the stage, opening a new era in which that rationality will be definitely detached from ethics. And when management of people and things is delivered to the logic of science and capital, one of the first effects is the objectification of people and the personification of objects. Let me give you an example. Some days ago, a friend of mine, a philosopher, and I were having fun with Siri, that is, that amazing program of speech recognition that was developed by Apple company. You can talk to the phone, and a sweet and seductive virtual female secretary, I don't know why they have chosen a female voice, executes orders and answers to, let's say, almost all kinds of questions. So eager to put her in trouble, we asked her what was her opinion about the sexual life. Her answer was so human that we were astounded. I have no idea, she said. So by making blank slate of the order that was ruled by the name of the Father, modernity has produced a completeness, a fullness of the world, in the sense of a full conquer of reality. The discourse of modernity doesn't allow, or at least it makes as much as possible to prevent the existence of an outside, I mean an alternative discourse. The outside only exists through the ejected waste, especially the human waste. As the very well-known Zygmunt Bauman pointed out, the new fullness of the planet means essentially a severe crisis of the industry of elimination of human residues. Some of you maybe have read a very interesting book that appeared, I think that 3 or 4 years ago, Gomorra, written by the Italian journalist Roberto Saviano. A book that one critical, criticizer? Someone who critiques books? A critic. A critic defined as an essay of aesthetics in the 21st century. Give me a minute because I booked the English e-book version because I didn't dare to make my own translation. No. I quote, this is the beginning of the first chapter of Gomorrah. The container swayed as the crane hoisted it onto the ship. The spreader, which hooks the container to the crane, was unable to control its movement. So it seemed to float in the air. The hatches, which had been improperly closed, suddenly sprang open, and dozens of bodies started raining down. They looked like mannequins, but when they hit the ground, their heads split open as if their skulls were real. And they were. Men, women, even a few children came tumbling out of the container. All dead, frozen, stacked one on top of another, packed like sardines. These were the Chinese who never die, the eternal ones who trade identity papers among themselves. So this is where they ended up. The bodies that in the wildest fantasies might have been cooked in Chinese restaurants, buried in fields beside factories, or tossed into the mouth of Vesuvius. Here they were, spilling from the container by the dozen, their names scribbled on tags and tied with string around their necks. They'd all put aside money so they could be buried in China, back in their hometowns, a percentage withheld from their salaries to guarantee their return voyage once they were dead. A space in a container and a hole in some strip of Chinese soil. Coming back to Bauman, the global spreading of modern life set free a huge and constantly increasing amount of human beings deprived from their ordinary proper ways and means of survival, both in the biological and cultural sense of the word. There are no easily available exits for these populations, neither for their recycling nor for their safe elimination. In other words, material and human waste form a new real, but it in this case is a real definitely out of sense, a real known, regulated by the predictability of a law, a real that is produced by a discourse that pretends to get rid of any kind of liability concerning the cause. Maybe some of you will remember Lacan's words in Seminary 17 when he poses the idea that science is a discourse that wants to know nothing about the cause of his own desire. The old notion of the reserve army of labor, that whole concept, a labor force that when necessary was ready and available to get into the production system, belongs to the universe in which the name of the Father still kept a certain control of the game rules. Because the reserve army, in spite of its miserable condition, was part of the system. in the same way as this, what is kept, for example, in the kitchen cupboard, is not the same that is thrown away. Today, the reserve army has given place to a huge migratory population that lives in the non-world and whose constant endeavors to return to the system from which it has been exiled become a serious problem for the states. The states that since the last decades have renounced to their political function and work only as a task force and bodyguards of the international financial power. And in a world where producers die out for the benefit of an exponential increase of consumers, there are few people prepared to cope with their own detritus. We have been raised to satisfy immediately our desires, but nobody wants to assume the consequences. For example, when the workers that stayed in the poison bubbles of the Japanese nuclear power plant of Fukushima, when they tried to go back to their homes, they found the dreadful rejection of their neighbors. Something similar to what was suffered by the Vietnam veterans or even the survivors of the concentration camps, because nobody wants to know anything about the messengers of disgrace, as Bertolt Brecht wrote. A disgrace produced by that rationality detached from any kind of moral obstacle. Unfortunately, we're very far from the possibility of perceiving in all its magnitude how this untenable growth of human residues will affect the everyday, more uncertain equilibrium. Probably one of the brightest intellectuals about this topic is the social psychologist Harald Welzer, a German man, who in his book The Climatic Wars predicts an increase of violence generated by the climatic change as a result of a suicidal manipulation of the real. And he says, I quote, "The climatic change is not only an issue of environment policy of high urgency, but at the same time it will turn into one of the most social challenges of modernity, threatening the opportunities of survival of millions of people, forcing them to massive migrations. This poses the inevitable question of how to deal with this migratory of irregular masses who can no longer live in those places where they belong to, and that want to share the survival chances of the privileged countries. So, from different angles and expressed through a multiplicity of phenomena, we see that an unavoidable process gets a more and more serious consistency. The return effect created by the irrepressible expansion of a discourse that is ruled by the law of use and throw away, a law that is applied equally to people and things, because both have lost their distinction. but we need to underline that this discourse gets its effectivity from an unconscious factor of the psychic structure that consists in the fact that the subject is, above all, in its more originary stages, an object of the desire of the other, and even an object of the response of the other. Something that may become a giving, a gift, a love proof, but also a tribute, a blackmail, a kidnap, a manipulation, a negotiation, a sacrifice. As Freud wrote in Civilization and its discontent, men are not gentle, friendly creatures wishing for love, who simply defend themselves if they are attacked, but a powerful measure of desire for aggression has to be reckoned as part of their instinctual endowment. The result is that their neighbor is to them not only a possible helper or sexual object, but also a temptation for them to gratify their aggressiveness on him, to exploit his capacity for work without recompense, to use him sexually without his consent, to seize his possessions, to humiliate him, to cause him pain, to torture and kill him. By giving to Jewish sons this crucial role in the psychodynamic and in the social bond, psychoanalysis prevents us from the innocence of believing that also the power structures are liable for the discontent and suffering we endure. Nowadays, technocracy, the technocracy that rules the destiny of the European community, has reduced hundreds of millions of people to figures that flow into a calculation of cost, benefits, and losses. A huge Schindler's List that turns the existing into a countable decision. There is no longer a waiting list for the overbooking of human beings. People that recently enjoyed the status of free citizens, taxpayers, users, and some other fictitious names, are being returned to their entity of negotiable objects. Politics openly turned into a politics openly turned into a bureaucratic and criminal management has not only abandoned any moral responsibility, but it has also become one of the biggest threats for the subjectivity survival, and in some extent for the physical survival. Technopolitics has definitely lost the control of human waste and begins to be interested in the prevention of consequences. Of course, in order to armor plate just part of the social body against the dangerous and undecidable ebb of those who have been rejected to the known world. This is the new and most dramatic form of our current discontent in our civilization. If in Freud's time this discontent was basically produced by the repression of the drives, that was, of course, a necessary principle for the civilization process itself. Today, the uneasiness seems to stem from the contrary, from a jouissance without limits and constraints, of a push to a satisfaction that has knocked down the dams of morality, solidarity, and love, and feeds the obscene and infinite greed of the superego that demands sacrifice. Against this panorama, psychoanalysis has few weapons to fight against, even though psychoanalysts are beginning to discuss how to do in order to make possible that the analytical discourse make its way and gets a certain influence on politics. By now, our debate is full of questions rather than real actions. When Freud considered that the modern nervousness was caused by the sexual repression and that civilization was in a great measure responsible for the cause of the neurosis suffered by most of people, he was considering that psychoanalysis had a very important task ahead that could not be limited to what happens within our private consultations. As long as the years went by, he lost his hope on psychoanalysis as being able to change the structure of society. That hope was beaten by that critical and at the same time lucid pessimism that allowed Freud not to step back in front of the most bitter truth about the human conditions. Anyway, I would like to quote the beautiful sentence of Max Weber that said, "History shows us that in order to be able to achieve what is possible, we must try to get the impossible once and again." This is a sentence that maybe sounds similar to something that Lacan said once concerning the analytical course. To assume that its loss is maybe the only chance we have to win it.